Hi, everyone. We are continuing our Jesus series today by talking about his death. You'll likely know at least part of his story, but I'll bet you don't know all of it. And what you don't know is also pretty important. So let's get started. To understand Jesus' death, we have to turn to the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are known as the Synoptic Gospels, are very similar, and scholars agree that all three had access to one common source text, but then add their own interpretations and some extra stories that their communities had shared. John, who had probably had one of the Gospel books, does his own thing, often offering a counterpoint to the Synoptic Gospels. But I think those differences are where we start to find God, where we find Jesus. We know that Jesus is fully God and fully human, but we see this play out differently in each book. In John's Gospel, it is clear that Jesus is God and is always in charge. And as I talk today, if I don't mention specifically what gospel that story is a part of, then it's in all four Gospels. So let's pick up where we left off when we talked about Jesus' life and ministry. Here's the scene. It's a few days before the Passover feast in Jerusalem. The religious leaders are scared of Jesus and his followers, decide that Jesus must be killed, and they start developing a plan to arrest him. Right before Jesus and his disciples get to Jerusalem, they stop in Bethany, where Jesus is anointed by a woman in the same way Jewish people would have anointed a dead body to prepare it for burial. Ominous. After the anointing, Judas, one of the 12 disciples, sets out to betray Jesus. In the Synoptics, he meets with the chief priests to help them arrest Jesus with a little cash. In John, there's no meeting. The devil has already tempted Judas. So let's skip now to where Jesus and his disciples share a meal, what we now know and celebrate as Maundy Thursday. In the Synoptic Gospels, it's the Passover feast that becomes the Last Supper, which is where the sacrament of communion comes from. Luke alone tells us to remember Jesus every time we do this. So when we have communion now, we are to be remembering the meal that Jesus shared right before he knew he was going to die. Interestingly, in John, there is no Last Supper ritual. Instead, before the Passover holiday, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. This is something that a slave would typically do. And Peter is understandably scandalized by this and refuses to let Jesus wash his feet. But Jesus says this is the kind of king he is, one who serves. If Peter is to have anything to do with his kingdom, he must let Jesus serve him, and Peter must serve as Jesus does. Okay. All right, so during the Passover meal, Jesus indicates that Judas will betray him. Regardless of the Gospel's slightly different details, Jesus communes with Judas, either through a meal or a foot washing, even though he knows what Judas is going to do. Knowing death was close, the disciples all say they'll stick with Jesus to the end, but then Jesus comes back and says that before the rooster crows the next morning, Peter will have denied knowing Jesus 3 times. Uh-oh. And then at this point, John kind of does his own thing again. For the next 4 chapters, it's a lot, Jesus teaches his disciples his last lessons and then prays with them one last time. In other words, he is preparing them for his departure. It's a farewell to his best friends. Jesus and his disciples then go to the garden in Gethsemane. While in the garden, Jesus emotionally wrestles with his fate, but ultimately accepts his death. And then Judas, the temple guards, and the high priest show up, and Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss. Ouch. As Jesus is arrested, the disciples clear out, except for Peter, who John and Luke tell us follow Jesus and the guards at a distance, trying to keep an eye and ear on things. While he's doing this, he's identified 3 times as a disciple and denies it each time. Then the rooster crows, and Peter weeps. According to Matthew, later on, Judas feels regret for his actions, returns the silver that they paid him, and he hangs himself. So Jesus is arrested and brought before the Jewish council called the Sanhedrin, where he is interrogated and beaten. they convict Jesus of the sin of blasphemy, which means he was calling himself God. This sin's penalty is death, but the Jews don't have the authority to execute sinners. They need the Romans to do it. However, the Romans won't care about his blasphemy, but they will care if Jesus has claimed to be a king. That would be viewed as treason. So, the next morning, they take Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. In the Synoptics, Jesus remains silent as he's questioned by Pilate. When Pilate asks if he's the king of the Jews, he replies, "Those are your words, not mine." But in John, Jesus won't shut up. He gives Pilate a speech and debates him on the nature of truth. He says that he is a king, but his authority comes not from this world. And this scared Pilate. But regardless of the gospel, Pilate doesn't see a reason to kill Jesus. The next thing that happens is only in Mark. Pilate sends Jesus to Herod, the current Jewish king. Herod is excited to meet this Jesus, the miracle worker that he's heard so much about. He hopes Jesus will perform for him, but Jesus won't even speak. So Herod doesn't see a reason to kill Jesus either, sends him back to Pilate. With no clear confession, Pilate gives the Jewish people a choice between setting either Jesus or Barabbas free. Now, Barabbas is a terrorist who has murdered people. So obviously, the crowd chooses him. When Pilate asks what Jesus has done to deserve death, the crowd doesn't have an answer. They just want him dead. Jesus is then dressed in a royal robe, made to wear a crown of thorns, so like thorns that stick into your head, and is beaten. In John, Jesus is then brought in front of the crowd again, and Pilate appeals one last time to the Jewish crowds, like, "Are you sure you want me to crucify your king?" And they're like, "Yep, that's what we want." So in Matthew, after agreeing to crucifying Jesus, Pilate symbolically washes his hands of the responsibility for Jesus' death, probably feeling a little guilt. Barabbas is released, and Jesus is flogged 39 times, meaning within an inch of his life. Now that the sentence has been passed, Jesus is led to Golgotha, which is a hill that looks like a skull carrying his cross. In the Synoptics, the Romans grab a random guy off the street, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross for him. But in John, Jesus carries his own cross because Jesus is in charge, even in his suffering and humiliation. There are no details in the text about crucifixion, which tells us that the original audience of all four Gospels knew exactly what that was. But we as today's readers don't. What we do know, we know from Roman history. So Jesus would have been not very high up, maybe only a few feet off the ground, low enough that people could touch him. He was also naked while being nailed to that cross with a sign above him that said, "The King of the Jews." Everything about crucifixion was designed to prolong suffering and at the highest levels of humiliation. And in the midst of this humiliation, Jesus says in Luke's Gospel, "Forgive them, Father. They don't know what they're doing." In Matthew and Mark, there are criminals crucified to his left and his right, both of whom mock him. In Luke, only one of the criminals mocks Jesus, but the other one defends him and says, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replies, "Today you will be with me in paradise." John only mentions these criminals in passing. The Synoptics all agree that from noon to 3, the sky went dark, and at the moment of Jesus' death, the temple curtain was torn from top to bottom. And y'all, this is significant. This was the curtain that closed off the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple. It was thought that this is where God dwelled on earth. It was very thick and extremely tall. Tearing it in two while still hanging was a task impossible for humans to accomplish. What was truly terrifying to the Jewish people was this: the curtain protected them from God's glory, which they believed would kill them. The curtain tore, and God's glory was not there. The only thing more terrifying than God being behind the curtain is God not being where they thought God should be. So this is to indicate that God's glory was found in the person of Jesus. Matthew's gospel is even more frightening because some people are resurrected at that moment, leaving their graves and entering the temple. So don't forget to tell your parents today that you learned about the zombie temple invasion. Depending on which gospel you read, Jesus has different last words. In Matthew and Mark, he cries out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" In Luke, he says, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." John has two last phrases. First, Jesus says, "I'm thirsty," in order to fulfill an Old Testament prophecy. After he is given something to drink, he says, "It is finished," and then dies. Jesus is even in charge when he dies. Also, only in the book of John, a centurion pierces Jesus' side with a spear to confirm that he was truly dead, and the water that poured out was again another prophecy fulfilled. Next, Joseph of Arimathea prepares Jesus' body and places him in a tomb. In Matthew, the chief priests and Pharisees are concerned that Jesus' followers will try to steal the body and claim that Jesus has been resurrected. So Pilate has the tomb sealed and posts a guard. And that's where we are ending for today. As I mentioned at the beginning, it takes all four Gospels to scratch the surface of who Jesus is. Mark wants you to hear the good news of Jesus' kingdom. Matthew wants you to see a promise fulfilled. Luke wants to have an ordered account, and John writes his gospel so you may believe. Through these four accounts, we see that Jesus is a human just like us who suffers greatly and dies. Jesus is also a God beyond comprehension, even in death. I hope you all come back next week because, in case you hadn't heard, death isn't the end of the story. Have a great discussion, everybody. Bye-bye.